Millionaire meets a 5-year-old boy. By accident, never imagining it would lead him back to ex-wife. The sharp, rhythmic click of Ethan Walsh's polished leather shoes echoed through the grand lobby of the Waldorf Astoria, Chicago. The evening's charity gala was his creation, an event designed to celebrate his company's recent milestone, securing its place as one of the fastest-growing tech firms in the country. The crystal chandeliers above bathed the room in a soft golden glow, while servers in crisp black uniforms weaved through the crowd with trays of champagne. On the surface, it was a night to remember. Yet, for Ethan, it was just another meticulously planned event in a string of obligations that filled his calendar. He stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, a half-empty glass of bourbon in his hand, looking out at the shimmering Chicago skyline. The city lights sparkled like stars, a sprawling testament to human ambition. Ethan had always loved this view. It was a reminder of how far he had come. From a cramped apartment in Logan Square to a penthouse overlooking Millennium Park, his journey had been nothing short of extraordinary, but tonight the view felt distant, almost hollow. At 36, Ethan Walsh was the kind of man who commanded attention without trying. His sharp jawline, neatly trimmed beard, and tailored charcoal suit gave him an air of effortless sophistication. His dark eyes, however, carried a quiet intensity that made people think twice before crossing him. Ethan had built his empire from the ground up. His company, Neurotech, revolutionized AI-driven solutions for urban infrastructure, a field that earned him both accolades and immense wealth. To the outside world, he was a man who had it all: money, power, and influence. But those who knew him truly knew him, understood that his success had come at a cost. "Ethan, the mayor's looking for you." Laura Bennett, his assistant, said as she approached. Her tone was professional but familiar, a reflection of their years working together. Ethan turned, giving her a faint smile. "Let him wait. I need a moment." Laura hesitated. She knew Ethan well enough to recognize the weight in his voice. "Sure," she said, stepping back, though her expression betrayed her concern. Alone again, Ethan sipped his bourbon, the warmth spreading through his chest, doing little to ease the ache beneath it. Nights like these reminded him of how far he'd drifted from who he used to be. Somewhere along the way, amid the late nights, the endless deals, and the relentless climb, he'd lost something he couldn't quite name. The sound of laughter pulled Ethan's attention to a nearby group of guests. A young couple stood at the center, their fingers intertwined, their faces lit with unrestrained joy. The sight struck him unexpectedly, like a punch to the chest. He looked away quickly, but the memory had already surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. Amelia Harper. The name was a whisper in his mind, as familiar and as painful as an old wound. It had been over a decade since she'd walked out of his life, leaving behind only a brief note. "I'm sorry, Ethan. This is for the best." He had read those words so many times that they were etched into his memory. Amelia had been his first love, his everything during a time when he had nothing. They'd met at a local coffee shop where she worked part-time while studying to become a teacher. Her warmth and optimism had been a balm to his struggling younger self. She believed in him when no one else did, urging him to chase his dreams. For years, they were inseparable. He had planned a life with her, a future that included long walks by the lake, a house filled with laughter, and the kind of love that could weather any storm. But then she was gone, leaving only unanswered questions and a gaping hole in his heart. Ethan's grip on the glass tightened. He had buried those memories under layers of ambition, convincing himself that success would fill the void she'd left. But no amount of money, power, or accolades could erase the ache of what might have been. "Ethan," Laura's voice interrupted his thoughts again. She had returned, her expression now tinged with urgency. "The auction is starting. They need you to announce the opening bid." "Of course," Ethan replied, slipping the mask of composure back into place. He set his glass down and straightened his tie before following her to the stage. As he stepped into the spotlight, the room erupted in applause. He flashed the crowd a practiced smile, his words smooth and confident as he welcomed them to the evening's festivities. Yet, as his gaze swept over the audience, something or someone caught his eye. In the far corner of the room stood a woman with long chestnut hair, her back to him as she adjusted the tie of a small boy by her side. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. The woman turned slightly, just enough for Ethan to catch a glimpse of her profile. His heart stuttered. It couldn't be. "Amelia?" Ethan faltered, his polished speech briefly interrupted. He quickly recovered, but his mind was racing. What was she doing here? And the boy, was he hers? Questions swirled in his mind, each more unsettling than the last. The auction proceeded, but Ethan's attention was elsewhere. He found himself scanning the crowd repeatedly, searching for her again. But when the lights dimmed and the focus shifted to the items being bid on, she was nowhere to be seen. For the rest of the evening, a quiet tension coiled in Ethan's chest. He knew he couldn't let this go. If it really was Amelia, he needed answers. Why had she left? What had happened to her? And why, after all these years, had she reappeared in the most unexpected way? As the night wound down and the guests began to leave, Ethan remained by the windows, his earlier thoughts replaced by a single, consuming question: what if this is my second chance? The following morning arrived cloaked in heavy clouds, the sun struggling to pierce through the gloom. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, Ethan watched as the rain began to patter against the glass, its rhythm steady and relentless. Chicago's skyline stretched before him, a city alive with movement, yet he felt oddly disconnected from it all. The events of the previous night lingered in his mind like a haunting refrain, every detail replayed with maddening clarity: the soft glow of the gala lights, the hum of the crowd, and that fleeting glimpse of her. Amelia. Ethan closed his eyes and leaned against the cold steel of the window frame, trying to steady his thoughts. Had it really been her? Or had his mind conjured her image out of a cruel sense of nostalgia? After all, it wasn't the first time he'd thought he'd seen her, only for reality to dash his hopes. But this time felt different. The moment had been too vivid to dismiss. "Mr. Walsh, your 10 a.m. is waiting in the conference room." Laura's voice crackled through the intercom, cutting through his reverie. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. The day's schedule was packed, as usual. Meetings, investor calls, and a late lunch with a potential partner, all things that required his full attention. But his mind refused to stay present. After a beat, he pressed the button to respond. Push it back by 30 minutes. A brief pause on the other end. Laura's tone was measured but carried a hint of exasperation. "Understood. I'll reschedule." Ethan didn't miss the subtle reprimand in her voice, but he didn't care. There was a more pressing matter at hand. He turned to his phone, scrolling through the contacts until he found Laura's name. A quick text followed. "Find out if Amelia Harper was at the gala last night. Discreetly." The message was short, direct, and left little room for interpretation. Laura, efficient as always, would uncover the truth. Ethan just hoped he was ready to face it. By the afternoon, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving the city slick and gleaming under the muted light. Ethan's phone buzzed with an incoming text as he stepped into his car, the sleek black interior, a sanctuary from the outside world. He glanced at the screen, his pulse quickening. Amelia Harper confirmed to be at the gala, attended as a guest of the Harper Foundation, a small non-profit focused on educational outreach. She left early with a child, approximately 5 years old. No further details yet. The message was clinical, typical of Laura's style. But to Ethan, it read like a bolt of lightning. She'd been there. It hadn't been his imagination. And the child, was he hers? The timing made sense, didn't it? 5 years. The thought settled uncomfortably in his chest. If the boy was hers, why hadn't she told him? Ethan couldn't shake the urgency building within him. He had spent years burying his feelings for Amelia, convincing himself that the past was better left where it belonged. But now, with her reappearance, old wounds were reopening. There was a part of him that demanded answers, not only for the questions she had left him with, but also for the emotions she had reignited. He dialed Laura's number, his fingers tightening around the phone as it rang. "Mr. Walsh," Laura answered crisply. "Do you have her address?" Ethan asked without preamble, his voice sharper than intended. Laura hesitated. "I do." "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Just send it to me." Another pause. Then, reluctantly, she replied, "I'll text it to you, but I think you should think about what you're hoping to achieve here." Ethan ended the call without responding. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to achieve. Closure, clarity, or maybe just the chance to see her again, to understand why she'd vanished from his life and why her reappearance now felt like a challenge to everything he'd built. By late afternoon, Ethan found himself driving through a neighborhood that was worlds apart from the gleaming skyscrapers and bustling streets of downtown Chicago. The houses here were modest but well kept, their front yards dotted with flower beds and bicycles. It was a place that felt lived in, comfortable and warm in a way his life hadn't been for years. He pulled up to a small two-story house, painted a soft shade of blue, the address Laura had sent him. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he stared at the house, the weight of what he was about to do settling heavily on his chest. Through the front window, he saw movement. Amelia. She was in the living room, folding what looked like a stack of children's clothes. She looked just as he remembered her, though her features carried a quiet weariness now. Her long chestnut hair was tied back, a loose strand falling against her cheek. She was smiling faintly, her expression soft and maternal. Ethan's throat tightened. For a moment, he considered turning around and leaving. Maybe Laura was right. Maybe this was a mistake. But then he saw the boy Charlie dart into the room, his laughter carrying faintly through the closed windows. Amelia bent down, ruffling his hair as she spoke to him. The sight made Ethan's heart ache in a way he hadn't anticipated. He opened the car door, stepping out into the damp air. The path to the house felt longer than it was, every step weighted with doubt and hesitation. When he finally reached the door, he paused, his hand hovering over the knocker. What would he even say? Before he could decide, the door opened suddenly, and there she was, Amelia Harper, standing mere feet away. Her smile froze, her eyes widening in shock as she took him in. "Ethan," she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The rain had stopped, but the world felt suspended in time, the space between them heavy with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Hello, Amelia. It's been a long time." Amelia's grip on the edge of the door tightened as she stared at Ethan, the color draining from her face. It wasn't just shock. It was the weight of a decade's worth of unspoken truths crashing down on her all at once. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Ethan's gaze, sharp and searching, pinned her in place. "Amelia," he said again, his voice softer this time, but the tension beneath it was unmistakable. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." She swallowed hard, her hand trembling slightly as she pushed the door open wider. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping forward. "I think you know why I'm here." Amelia's eyes darted toward the living room, where the muffled sound of a cartoon played. The thought of Charlie overhearing this conversation made her chest tighten. She shifted her weight, leaning subtly to block Ethan's view of the inside. "This isn't a good time," she said quickly, her tone more defensive than she intended. "You should go." But Ethan wasn't moving. His jaw clenched and his gaze flickered toward the window, where he had seen her and Charlie just minutes before. "Not until we talk. I have questions you owe me answers to." Amelia flinched at the words, the truth of them hitting harder than she expected. She wanted to close the door, to retreat into the safety of her carefully constructed life. But she knew Ethan too well. He wouldn't leave without the answers he came for. After a long, tense pause, she sighed and stepped aside. "Fine. 5 minutes. Ethan stepped into the house, the warm, lived-in space a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of his penthouse. The faint smell of lavender lingered in the air, mingling with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. A small stack of children's books sat on the coffee table, alongside a half-finished Lego project. It was a scene of quiet domesticity, yet it felt charged with an undercurrent of tension. Amelia gestured toward the couch, but Ethan remained standing, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "You disappeared without a word," he began, his voice low but steady. "You left me a note, Amelia. A note, and then you vanished." She folded her arms, her gaze falling to the floor. "I didn't think you'd come all this way just to rehash the past." "The past?" Ethan's voice rose slightly, the raw edge of his emotions breaking through. "Do you think this is just about the past? You were everything to me, and you walked away without an explanation. I spent years trying to understand what I did wrong." Amelia looked up sharply, her eyes brimming with a mix of anger and regret. "You didn't do anything wrong, Ethan." "Then why?" he pressed, taking a step closer. "Why did you leave? Why didn't you tell me?" His voice caught, his eyes flickering toward the hallway. "Why didn't you tell me about him?" Amelia's breath hitched, her chest tightening as the question she'd feared finally came to light. Her instinct was to deny it, to deflect, but she knew it was futile. Ethan wasn't a man who backed down easily, and the look in his eyes told her he wouldn't accept anything less than the truth. "Charlie," she said softly, her voice trembling. "His name is Charlie." Ethan's face paled, his expression unreadable as the weight of her words settled in. "He's mine, isn't he?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement, spoken with quiet certainty. Amelia hesitated, the silence between them stretching unbearably. "Yes," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's your son." Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair as he turned away. The revelation hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over him with a force he hadn't anticipated. His mind raced, trying to piece together the implications of what she had just said. 5 years, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "You've had 5 years to tell me, Amelia. Why didn't you? Why didn't I deserve to know?" Tears welled in Amelia's eyes as she stepped closer. "Because I was scared, Ethan. Scared of what it would mean for both of us. You were just starting your company. You had so much on your plate. I didn't want to ruin everything you worked for." "Ruin?" Ethan turned back to her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. "You think telling me I had a son would have ruined me? Amelia, you took away my chance to be there for him, to be his father." Before Amelia could respond, a small voice called from the hallway. "Mom, who's here?" Amelia's head snapped toward the sound, panic flashing across her face. Ethan followed her gaze to see Charlie peeking around the corner, his messy brown hair and curious eyes strikingly familiar. The sight of the boy sent a jolt through Ethan's chest, the resemblance undeniable. "Hey, buddy," Amelia said quickly, her voice softening as she crouched down to meet Charlie's gaze. "This is an old friend of mine. He just stopped by to say hello." Charlie's eyes flickered to Ethan, his small hand clutching the edge of the wall. "Hi," he said shyly, his voice barely audible. Ethan's throat tightened as he crouched down, trying to meet the boy's gaze. "Hi, Charlie," he said, his voice gentler than before. "It's nice to meet you." Charlie nodded, his eyes darting between his mother and Ethan. "Are you staying for dinner?" Amelia's breath caught, and she quickly shook her head. "No, honey. Mr. Walsh was just leaving." Ethan straightened, his jaw tightening at the dismissal. "Actually, I think there's more we need to talk about," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Amelia's eyes narrowed slightly, a silent warning passing between them. "Charlie, why don't you go finish your puzzle in the living room? I'll be right there." The boy hesitated but eventually nodded, disappearing back down the hallway. As soon as he was out of earshot, Amelia turned to Ethan, her voice low and urgent. "You don't just get to walk in here and demand answers. And you don't get to shut me out again," Ethan shot back. I have a right to know my son. You don't get to take that away from me. Amelia's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. I didn't mean to hurt you, Ethan, she said softly. I was just trying to do what I thought was best. For Charlie. For you. Ethan's expression softened slightly, though the tension in his jaw remained. You don't get to decide what's best for me, Amelia. That's not how this works. Silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of their shared history. Finally, Ethan exhaled, his voice quieter but no less firm. I want to be part of his life. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'm not walking away from this, from him. Amelia nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Okay, she said finally, but this has to happen on Charlie's terms. He's my first priority. Ethan nodded, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Mine too. For the first time, a fragile truce settled between them. It wasn't perfect, it was far from it, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. The air in Amelia's living room was heavy, charged with unspoken tension, as Ethan settled into the worn armchair across from her. The cozy space was a stark contrast to his sleek, modern penthouse, a room filled with warmth, from the mismatched cushions on the couch to the stack of children's books balanced precariously on the side table. Every detail spoke to the life Amelia had built without him, and every detail reminded Ethan of how much he'd missed. Amelia sat across from him, her posture stiff, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The quiet was broken only by the faint sound of Charlie's voice in the next room, humming as he pieced together his puzzle. Ethan's eyes flickered toward the doorway, drawn to the sound. "Does he know?" Ethan finally asked, his voice low. Amelia looked away, her fingers tightening around each other. "No," she admitted. "He doesn't know about you." The words stung, sharper than Ethan expected. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Why not? You've had 5 years, Amelia." Her head snapped up, her eyes flashing with a mixture of guilt and defiance. "Because it wasn't that simple," she said, her voice trembling. "You think I wanted to keep this from him, from you. I didn't. But I couldn't just—" She stopped, exhaling shakily. "You don't understand how hard it was." "Then help me understand," Ethan pressed, his voice softening but still firm. "Why did you leave, Amelia? Why did you decide I didn't deserve to know?" Amelia's gaze dropped to her lap, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her choices was finally too much to bear. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were just starting Neurotech. I saw how much pressure you were under, how much you were sacrificing to make it work. I didn't want to be the thing that made you choose between your dream and us." Ethan's jaw tightened, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "You think I wouldn't have chosen you, chosen our family?" "I didn't know," she said, her voice breaking. "You were so focused, so determined to succeed. And I told myself that if I told you, you'd feel trapped or worse, you'd resent me for holding you back." Ethan leaned back, running a hand through his hair as he tried to process her words. "So you made the choice for me," he said bitterly. "You decided what I could handle, what I deserved to know." Tears shimmered in Amelia's eyes, but she blinked them away. "It wasn't fair. I know that now. But at the time, it felt like the only choice I had." The weight of her confession hung between them, filling the small room like a storm cloud. Ethan glanced toward the doorway again, his thoughts drifting to Charlie. "And what about him?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Doesn't he deserve to know who his father is?" Amelia's lips pressed into a thin line. "He's happy, Ethan. He has a good life." "I didn't want to disrupt that." "Disrupt it?" Ethan repeated, his frustration flaring again. "Amelia, I'm his father. How is that a disruption?" She shook her head, her hands twisting together. "You don't understand. Charlie doesn't know what it's like to have a father. He doesn't miss what he's never had. But if he gets to know you, if he starts to depend on you, and then—" "And then what?" Ethan interrupted, his voice rising. "You think I'll walk away?" That I'll abandon him? Is that what you really think of me? Amelia flinched, her eyes filling with tears. I don't know what to think, Ethan. I don't know who you are anymore. The man I knew, he's not the man who walked into my house today. Ethan's chest tightened at her words. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the truth was, he didn't know if he could. The man he'd been when they were together felt like a distant memory, buried under years of ambition and success. The tension in the room felt unbearable, the silence between them growing heavier with each passing second. Finally, Ethan exhaled, his voice softer. I don't know who I am either, Amelia. Not anymore, but I do know that I want to be part of Charlie's life. I need to be. Amelia looked at him, her expression conflicted. And what happens when your life pulls you away? Your company, your responsibilities. What happens when Charlie needs you, and you're not there? Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. I'll be there, he said firmly. Whatever it takes, I'll be there. Amelia studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something, truth perhaps, or sincerity. This isn't just about you, Ethan, she said quietly. It's about Charlie. If you're serious about being part of his life, then you have to show him. You can't just walk in and expect everything to fall into place. I don't expect it to be easy, Ethan replied, but I'm willing to do the work, whatever it takes. Before Amelia could respond, the sound of small footsteps echoed from the hallway. Charlie appeared in the doorway, clutching a small toy car in his hands. His curious gaze shifted between Ethan and his mother. Mum, he asked, his voice hesitant, is everything okay? Amelia forced a smile, her voice softening. Everything's fine, sweetie. Mr. Walsh and I were just talking. Charlie nodded, his attention shifting to Ethan. Are you staying for dinner? He asked again, his earlier question lingering like an unspoken invitation. Ethan hesitated, his heart tightening at the boy's innocent question. He glanced at Amelia, searching her face for permission. She looked torn, but eventually nodded. Only if it's okay with you, Ethan said, crouching slightly to meet Charlie's gaze. Charlie grinned, his excitement clear. Okay, we're having spaghetti. It's my favorite. Ethan smiled faintly, the tension in his chest easing just a little. I think I might like spaghetti too. Dinner was a quiet affair, the clinking of forks and the occasional laughter from Charlie, the only sounds that filled the room. Ethan found himself watching the boy closely, noting the small details, the way his nose scrunched when he concentrated, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his favorite toys. Every moment felt surreal, like seeing a reflection of himself in someone he was only just beginning to know. Amelia remained guarded, her gaze flickering between Ethan and Charlie, with a mixture of caution and something else, hope, perhaps, or fear of hoping too much. As the evening wore on, Ethan felt the first flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, connection. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. And for the first time, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. The hum of the evening settled like a blanket over the house as Amelia cleared the dinner table. The clatter of plates and silverware filled the quiet space, a stark contrast to the tense conversations that had unfolded earlier. Ethan remained seated at the table, his gaze fixed on the doorway where Charlie had disappeared minutes earlier to grab one of his toys. He looked distant, his thoughts a storm of questions, emotions, and uncertainty. Amelia placed a dish in the sink, wiping her hands on a towel before turning to him. Her posture was guarded, her arms crossing instinctively over her chest. You don't have to stay, she said softly, though there was no hostility in her tone. I'm sure you have things to get back to. Ethan shook his head, his expression resolute. I'm staying. If he's willing to let me, I want to spend more time with him. Amelia's lips pressed into a thin line. This isn't about what you want, Ethan. It's about what's best for Charlie. And what's best for him is to know his father, Ethan said, his voice steady but edged with conviction. You can't keep me from him, Amelia. Not anymore. Her eyes flashed with a mix of frustration and vulnerability. "I never wanted to keep you from him," she replied, her voice trembling. "But you have to understand, Charlie doesn't know you. You can't just walk in and expect everything to fall into place overnight." Ethan exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "I know it won't be easy," he admitted. "But I'm willing to do the work. I'm not going anywhere." The sound of small footsteps interrupted their conversation. Charlie appeared in the doorway, clutching a worn teddy bear in one hand and a toy car in the other. His face lit up when he saw Ethan still at the table. "Look," Charlie said excitedly, holding up the toy car. "It's my favorite. It goes super fast." Ethan forced a smile, his earlier tension melting at the sight of the boy's enthusiasm. "That's a pretty cool car," he said, crouching slightly to meet Charlie's eye level. "Do you want to show me how fast it goes?" Charlie nodded eagerly, rushing over to the table and setting the car down. He pushed it across the surface, his laughter bubbling up as it skidded to a stop near Ethan's hand. For a moment, the weight of the evening lifted, replaced by the simple joy of a child's excitement. Amelia watched from the kitchen, her heart tightening at the sight. It was a scene she had envisioned so many times over the years, Charlie bonding with his father, sharing moments of joy and discovery. But seeing it now, in real life, was almost too much to bear. She turned back to the sink, gripping the edge tightly as she tried to steady her emotions. As the evening wore on, the tension in the room eased slightly. Charlie continued to chatter about his toys, his favorite cartoons, and the friends he played with at school. Ethan listened intently, nodding and asking questions that seemed to delight the boy. "Do you have a teddy bear?" Charlie asked suddenly, holding up his own for emphasis. "Mine's name is Captain Fluffy." Ethan chuckled softly. "I used to have one when I was your age. His name was Mr. Snuggles." Charlie giggled, the sound filling the room with warmth. "Mr. Snuggles. That's a funny name." Amelia, who had just returned to the table, couldn't help but smile faintly at the exchange. It was a small moment, but it carried a weight she couldn't ignore. "Charlie," she said gently, kneeling beside him, "it's time to get ready for bed, sweetheart." Charlie's face fell slightly, his excitement dimming. "But I want to play more." "We can play again," Ethan said quickly, his voice kind but firm. "Next time, okay." Charlie's eyes brightened at the promise. "Really? Really?" Ethan said, nodding. "I'll come back soon." As Amelia guided Charlie down the hall to his room, Ethan remained at the table, his hands resting on his lap. The house felt quieter now, the energy shifting as the reality of the situation settled over him again. He had spent years building an empire, making decisions that affected thousands of people, but this building a relationship with his son felt like the most important challenge of his life. When Amelia returned, her expression was guarded once more. She leaned against the doorway, her arms crossed. "He likes you," she said softly, her voice laced with both hope and caution. Ethan looked up at her, his gaze steady. "I like him too. He's incredible." A faint smile touched her lips, but it faded quickly. "This won't be easy, Ethan, for any of us." "I don't expect it to be," he replied. "But I'm not giving up, Amelia. I lost too much time already." Her eyes flickered with emotion, but she quickly masked it. "You'll need to take it slow," she said. "Charlie's life has been steady, predictable. If you come in too fast, it'll overwhelm him." Ethan nodded, understanding the unspoken warning in her words. "I'll follow your lead. Just don't shut me out." Amelia hesitated, her defenses wavering. "I won't," she said finally, her voice barely audible. As Ethan stepped outside, the cool night air hit him like a breath of clarity. The stars were faint against the city's glow, but the quiet suburb felt miles away from the chaos of downtown Chicago. He climbed into his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he stared at the house in his rearview mirror. The evening had been a small step forward, but it was just the beginning. There were still so many questions, so many uncertainties. But for the first time in years, Ethan felt a spark of hope that he could be the father Charlie deserved, and maybe, just maybe, find his way back to the life he'd once dreamed of. As he drove away, the image of Charlie's bright smile lingered in his mind, a beacon guiding him toward the future he was determined to build. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act, with Ethan navigating the uncertain terrain of building a relationship with Charlie while trying to repair the shattered bridge between himself and Amelia. Every interaction felt like stepping onto thin ice. One wrong move, and everything could crack beneath him. For Ethan, patience had never been his strength. His life had been built on quick decisions, bold risks, and relentless ambition. But with Charlie, he found himself slowing down, learning to match the boy's rhythm rather than imposing his own. It was a humbling, disarming experience, one that left Ethan both exhilarated and terrified. True to his word, Ethan returned to Amelia's house the following weekend. He arrived early, carrying a small gift for Charlie, a beginner's art set he had chosen, after Laura subtly suggested it might align with Charlie's interests. The quiet suburban street felt more familiar this time, though the nervous energy in his chest was just as strong. Amelia opened the door, her expression cautious but soft. "You're early," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I figured it's better than being late," Ethan replied, offering a small smile. Charlie came bounding down the hall moments later, his face lighting up when he saw Ethan. "You came back," he exclaimed, rushing forward. Ethan crouched to meet him, holding out the wrapped gift. "Of course I did. I told you I would." Charlie's eyes widened as he tore into the paper, revealing the art set. "Wow. Thank you, Mr. Walsh," he said, his excitement bubbling over. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then said gently, "You can call me Ethan if you want." Charlie paused, considering it for a moment before grinning. "Okay, Ethan." Amelia watched the exchange from a distance, her arms crossed as if to shield herself from the emotions stirring within her. The way Charlie beamed at Ethan, the easy rapport between them, it was everything she had feared and hoped for all at once. As Charlie busied himself with his new art supplies at the kitchen table, Amelia motioned for Ethan to join her in the living room. The tension between them felt less sharp than before, but it was still there, simmering beneath the surface. "He's really taken to you," she said, her voice low. Ethan nodded, his gaze lingering on Charlie. "He's an incredible kid. You've done a great job raising him." Amelia's lips twitched into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I tried my best," she said, her tone heavy with unspoken regret. "But he's never had this. A father. I want to change that," Ethan said firmly. "I know I can't make up for lost time, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Amelia turned to him, her eyes searching his face for something sincerity, perhaps, or reassurance. "Ethan, this isn't just about showing up. It's about consistency. Charlie needs to know he can count on you, even when things get hard." "I understand," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I'm not the man I was 10 years ago, Amelia. I've made mistakes, but I've also learned from them. I won't let him down." Amelia's expression softened slightly, though the guardedness in her eyes remained. "For his sake, I hope you mean that." As the day unfolded, Ethan found himself drawn deeper into the world Amelia had built. He listened as Charlie chattered about his favorite superhero, his best friend at school, and the big picture he wanted to draw with his new art set. Ethan couldn't help but marvel at the boy's boundless energy and curiosity, but there were quieter moments, 2 moments, when Ethan caught glimpses of Amelia's life, the sacrifices she had made to raise Charlie on her own. He noticed the worn edges of her furniture, the faint circles under her eyes, and the stack of lesson plans on the dining table. She had built a life for herself and Charlie, one that was simple but filled with love. Later in the afternoon, as Charlie napped on the couch, Ethan and Amelia sat on the porch. The late autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves, and the golden light of the setting sun cast long shadows across the yard. "You've done a lot for him," Ethan said quietly, breaking the silence. "I can see how much you've sacrificed." Amelia looked out at the street, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He's my world," she said softly. Everything I've done was for him. Ethan hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever regret it?" Leaving, her breath caught, and for a moment she didn't respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I regret the way I did it. I regret not trusting you enough to tell you the truth. But I don't regret choosing Charlie." Ethan nodded, her words cutting deeper than he expected. "I wish you had trusted me," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I would have been there, Amelia, for both of you." She turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and hope. "Maybe you would have," she said quietly, "but we'll never know. All we can do now is figure out how to move forward." As the day drew to a close, Ethan prepared to leave. Charlie clung to his leg, his face scrunching with disappointment. "Do you have to go?" he asked, his voice small. "I'll be back soon," Ethan promised, crouching to meet the boy's gaze. "I promise." Charlie nodded reluctantly, his grip loosening. "Okay, but don't forget." "I won't," Ethan said, ruffling his hair. As he stood, Amelia walked him to the door. The air between them was quieter now, less charged, but still complicated. Just as Ethan stepped outside, Amelia hesitated. "There's something you should know," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan turned back, his expression wary. "What is it?" She hesitated, then said, "Charlie's been asking about his father. Before you came back into our lives, he started noticing that his friends had dads, and he didn't. I told him his father was someone who cared about him, but couldn't be with us." Ethan's chest tightened at her words. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because," she said, her voice breaking, "I need you to understand how much this matters to him. You can't just be a visitor in his life, Ethan. If you're going to stay, you have to stay." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ethan nodded slowly, his voice firm. "I'm staying." Amelia searched his face for a moment, then stepped back inside. As the door closed, Ethan stood on the porch, the weight of her words settling over him like a storm cloud. He had made a promise, not just to Charlie, but to himself, and he intended to keep it. The days after Ethan's promise were a quiet test of his determination. Each visit to Amelia's home became a new thread in the delicate fabric of their relationship, a slow weaving of trust between the man he had become, the woman she had fought to be, and the boy who brought them together. But the journey was anything but easy. One brisk Saturday morning, Ethan arrived at Amelia's house carrying a small toolbox. Charlie had mentioned wanting to build a birdhouse after seeing one in his neighbor's yard, and Ethan had decided to surprise him. As he walked up the steps, the sound of Charlie's laughter drifted through the open window, warming the crisp air. Amelia opened the door, her expression neutral but her eyes betraying a trace of curiosity. "You're early again," she said. Ethan held up the toolbox with a small smile. "Charlie said he wanted to build a birdhouse. I thought we could do it together." Her brow furrowed, a mix of skepticism and something softer flashing across her face. "You don't have to keep trying so hard, Ethan." "Yes, I do," he replied simply, "because this matters." Amelia studied him for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in. "He's in the living room," she said, her tone lighter. Charlie's face lit up when he saw Ethan. "You're here," he exclaimed, bounding over. "What's that?" "It's a toolbox," Ethan said, crouching to open it. "I thought we could build something together. What do you think?" Charlie's eyes widened with excitement. "A birdhouse? Can we paint it too?" "Absolutely," Ethan said, his heart swelling at the boy's enthusiasm. Amelia watched from the doorway as they spread the materials out on the dining table, her arms crossed. There was something about the way Ethan interacted with Charlie, patient, attentive, genuine, that both eased and unsettled her. It was a glimpse of the man she had loved, but it was also a reminder of the years he hadn't been there. Later that afternoon, as Charlie napped in his room, Ethan and Amelia found themselves alone in the kitchen. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile. Amelia poured herself a cup of tea, her movements deliberate as if gathering her thoughts. "You're good with him," she said finally, her voice quiet. Ethan looked up from his phone, surprised by the compliment. "I'm trying," he said. "I've missed a lot, but I want to make up for it." Amelia nodded, her gaze distant. "It's not just about making up for lost time. It's about being there for the moments that matter, consistently." "I know," Ethan replied, "and I will be. But I still don't understand why you didn't tell me sooner." Her shoulders tensed, and she set her mug down with a quiet clink. "I was scared, Ethan. Scared of how it would change everything. Scared of how you'd react." "Didn't I deserve the chance to decide for myself?" he asked, his voice soft but weighted with emotion. Amelia turned to face him, her eyes brimming with guilt. "Maybe you did, but back then I convinced myself I was protecting you. From the pressure, from the responsibility. And maybe I was protecting myself too." Ethan leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "Protecting yourself from what?" "From getting hurt again," she admitted, her voice breaking. "You were so consumed with your company, Ethan. I didn't think there was room for us in your life." Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of her confession settling over him. "I would have made room," he said quietly. "I would have tried." "I know that now," she whispered. "But back then, I didn't." The turning point came a week later during Charlie's school play. He had begged Ethan to come, his eyes wide with excitement as he explained his role as a tree. It was a small part, but to Charlie, it was everything. Ethan arrived early, scanning the crowded auditorium for Amelia. When he spotted her near the front, he made his way over. She glanced up as he approached, her expression softening when she saw him. "You made it," she said. "Of course," Ethan replied, taking the seat beside her. "I wouldn't miss it." When the curtain rose, Ethan's gaze was fixed on Charlie. The boy's enthusiasm shone through, even in his simple costume. Ethan felt an unexpected lump in his throat as he watched, a mix of pride and longing overwhelming him. For the first time, he truly understood what he had missed and what he was determined to never miss again. After the play, Charlie ran up to him, his face flushed with excitement. "Did you see me?" he asked, bouncing on his toes. "You were amazing," Ethan said, crouching to meet his eyes. "The best tree I've ever seen." Charlie grinned, throwing his arms around Ethan's neck. The hug was brief but powerful, a moment Ethan would carry with him forever. That evening, after Charlie was asleep, Ethan and Amelia sat on the porch. The cool night air wrapped around them, the faint sound of crickets filling the silence. "You're really staying, aren't you?" Amelia asked, her voice tinged with both hope and uncertainty. "I am," Ethan said firmly. "Not just for Charlie, but for us. For what we had and what we could still have." Amelia looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Ethan, I'm not the same person I was back then." "Neither am I," he replied. "But maybe that's a good thing. We've both grown, both learned, and maybe now we can do this right." Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "It won't be easy." "I don't want easy," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I want real, and I want you." Amelia exhaled shakily, a small tentative smile breaking through. "Then maybe we can try." The weeks that followed were filled with small but significant steps, shared dinners, family outings, and moments of quiet connection. Each day brought them closer, not just as parents, but as partners rebuilding what had once been broken. On a bright spring morning, as they walked through the park, Charlie ran ahead, his laughter ringing out like music. Ethan and Amelia followed, their hands brushing together before Amelia finally slipped her fingers into his. As they watched Charlie chase a butterfly, Ethan turned to Amelia, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you for letting me back in." Amelia smiled, her eyes shining with emotion. "Thank you for proving I could." And in that moment, as the three of them stood together under the wide open sky, they knew they had found something precious, not just a family, but a chance to write a new story, one built on love, trust, and the resilience to start again. Life doesn't always give us the endings we expect, but sometimes it gives us something even better, a chance to start over. Ethan and Amelia's journey wasn't just about reconnecting, it was about forgiveness, growth, and finding strength in love. Together, they built a bridge over the years of pain and distance, creating a future where trust and family could thrive. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Join us for more unforgettable tales that remind us of the resilience of the human spirit. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.